Hello everyone. In today's Frontline Report, we are going to focus on Avdiivka, where we have a number of updates on a rapidly degrading situation for the Ukrainian army. So we are also going to go over some breakthroughs on the Bakhmut front as well. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Help us out by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. And don't forget to follow along on X and Telegram. Links are in the description. So I've added a new polygon here to represent Ukrainian front lines. So far, I've only done this in the Avdiivka area. I have avoided doing this in the past, but it seems like it is necessary to show the full extent of the situation in this case. So I actually am going to quickly turn on the assets here. So we could see the logistics situation. There are both some similarities and some differences here between what was going on in the Bakhmut cauldron last year and what's going on now in Avdiivka. In Bakhmut, there were only two roads, two roads leading into the city, and at one point, Russian troops were within a half a mile of both roads, probably closer than that, honestly. But it is important to note that the geography of that area was filled with hills, and in the case of both roads, they were for the most part shielded from Russian view and direct fire. Of course, at sometimes the Russians had managed to cross, the northern route, but the Ukrainians had pushed them back over the crest of the hill, so they couldn't actually see the road to fire on it well for big parts of the battle. In the case of Avdiivka, there were originally 5 roads here. The one going into the north was cut off, so at the moment there are 4 routes for supplies and reinforcements to enter into the city. On the other hand, the terrain west of the city is very flat and open, and on top of that, the Russians have created a buffer around the landfill here. Russian spotters can sit up on top of the hill, and they have a direct view over all of these supply routes. So, potentially very accurate, spotting for artillery. They can monitor all the traffic coming in and out. So, double the logistics routes, but, much, much lower utility for each road. The next logistics issue to point out, and this is highly relevant to the battle, 3 of the 4 roads enter into Avdiivka in the industrial zone. So taking any of these paths in order to reinforce the southern part, like the main body of Avdiivka, they all funnel into the same road. And let's go ahead and um, turn on this so we can see this Industrial Prospect Boulevard. All these roads are going to funnel into that. So it's basically the southern part of Avdiivka really only has 2 supply roads. Not to mention the Russians are basically, from their furthest extent, somewhere within 300, 400 meters of that road, depending on how you measure it. And this is actually a very large industrial structure, so you have to imagine the Russians have spotters on the roof, or they're at least trying to get them up there. So, very, very limited and very, very stressed logistic route here. So the other thing to consider with that is based on the length of the Ukrainian front line in the south. The bulk of Ukrainian troops engaged in the battle for Avdiivka are actually in the southern part of Avdiivka. So, most of the troops are surviving off of 2 very, very strained supply roads. So the situation actually for Avdiivka itself, excluding the factory and industrial zone, it seems to me is actually much worse than the logistics situation in Bakhmut. With that said, let's take a look at the battle itself. So, since the last update, the Russians have expanded control over many residential and industrial structures west of the railroad, including the vehicle depot, which is a very large industrial facility. I'll go ahead and mark that for you guys here. This is the vehicle depot. And they're now pushing south parallel to the rail line in the direction of the bus and train stations. So pushing down in this direction here. The vehicle depot is a very crucial position. As I mentioned in the last update, this is an area that Ukraine must counterattack. Remember, what I've just pointed out with the logistics in the area, but the counterattack will have to start with retaking that vehicle depot, which is a large industrial complex, so potentially a highly defensible position for the Russians. So this was a a bit of a disaster for this to fall into Russian hands so quickly. My guess is the Russian advance was taking place so fast, moving block to block and then attacking across the railroad. They probably were doing this before the Ukrainians were prepared and were dug in. I don't think the Ukrainians expected to have to fight for this area so soon, allowing the Russians to take it over rather rapidly. That being said, there have been some videos of fresh Ukrainian troops arriving on the outskirts of town. Some videos of Ukrainian, definitely troops that are coming from, not being in contact. Looks like mainly clean clothes, in some kind of staging area miles from the battlefield where you can hear the artillery and stuff, hitting in the distance. So it looks like these Ukrainian troops getting ready to move in. But at this point, the Russians are still expanding their positions, and there's been no word of a large Ukrainian counterattack up to this point. Which we might get some word of that before this video even gets posted. But as of this moment, that's the current situation. In the residential sector, the Russians continue to push south, capturing the western shore of the reservoir, along with several city blocks here, really diving into the center of the city. Moving to the far eastern Ukrainian defenses, this is a very strong position right here. This Ukrainian fortified position, which that's the wrong one. Very strong position. The Russians haven't had any success of capturing this yet. But now with this current situation here, it seems like the Russians really just need to put pressure in this direction down through here, capturing these dachas here, trying to move along the southern bank of the reservoir. If the Russians end up capturing all around the reservoir and capturing this particular area right here, which the geography here is difficult. There's structures for the Ukrainians to play defense in, as well as some hills and stuff. So that's might not be an easy task, but with the logistics situation, it could prove far more possible. Then this location here is effectively going to be cut off. So that's definitely one of the two locations that I see falling very soon, very soon. Moving to the southern part of the city, there's some changes here, some updates. The Ukrainians appear to have pushed the Russians out of the residential zone directly adjacent to the industrial zone at southern parts of town, but the Russians have expanded in a northern direction, kind of balancing out their lines, taking over some long-standing Ukrainian trench networks here on the far right-hand corner of the map. This is actually trench networks that were I believe original trenches from 2014 when the conflict went stale 9 years ago now, right? Or I guess it's now 10 years ago. Jeez. So in terms of this southern industrial zone, the Russians have expanded. It's actually kind of a dire situation here. The Russians captured the remainder of the forest belt. As we've talked many times, the Ukrainians you tend to make good use of these forest belts, but in this particular situation, it seems to have fallen pretty rapidly. And the Russians have actually crossed the railroad and captured some structures in this residential area along the 0505 highway that leads down to the Donetsk Beltway. Just south of that beltway is that Ukrainian air defense base, a highly fortified position. So if the Russians continue their success with jumping from structure to structure in these urban fights, and if they rapidly take over, even a quarter of this area, or if they just move a couple hundred feet down this road and capture this intersection here, that's going to almost completely cut off this location here. So, Ukrainians will have to move through the fields, move along this tree line to get out. Essentially, these two areas, to the far east and to the far south are inevitably will fall. It's tough for me to see a path where Ukraine holds on to them. It could be the case where Russia just decides to continue focusing their efforts on capturing the highway here and ignores these areas for now. But that seems very unlikely to me. Once these places are captured, the Russian front line could even out. That allows them, or the front line can shorten. That'll allow them to move troops to other places and start advancing. So it does the same thing for the Ukrainians, but at this point the Ukrainians are on low supply, and the Russians want to continue to pull troops from wherever they can to push the initiative in this battle. So I expect that to be the case. So on the southern flank of town in the Pervomaisk area, Russian forces have continued to move up the residential zone towards Pervomaisk. If you remember, I pointed this out as a place that potentially is a vulnerability for Russia. If Ukraine counterattacks here, Vadian and stuff, they could open up the southern flank and take some pressure off Avdiivka that way. It looks like the Russians are trying to fix that situation. So a final note on Avdiivka: the Ukrainians should be looking to protect this industrial prospect road at all costs and attempt to recapture a buffer zone. So probably the automobile plant. If they fail in doing this, then, and if they lose this industrial prospect road, when the Ukrainians inevitably do retreat from Avdiivka, which will have to happen at this point, they're only going to have one road and one field, it's fields to retreat through, and they're going to sustain very heavy losses doing that. So crucial point of the battle right here in the center of Avdiivka. All right, moving to Bakhmut, there's a a number of videos and reports coming out that the Russians have launched an attack and retaken some of the heights north of Ivanovska. That's the graveyard right here, and this force belt here, and a new force belt that's actually coming under their control. This is a pretty bad situation for Ukraine, and actually is a bad situation for Ivanovka, because that opens up Ivanovka to attacks from essentially both north and south. So it appears like Ivanovka is the next target in this area as of right now. But that, of course, can't predict the future. That might change. There's been another number of videos that have shown Russian armor, IFVs and tanks moving, in large numbers along the 0506 road. In my view, these videos came out after, a couple days after the word of the fall of these areas. But, it's tough to tell when exactly videos actually get released to the public. So if that's the case, then there could be a sizable Russian push coming up in the next few days, in order to seize more of this high ground, push further south, or expand the zone and expand into some of these forested areas here. All right, guys, that is all from me today. Thank you for joining, and until next time.